Hello, I'm Dilek Tuna. You're watching A News. Let's take a look at the top stories this hour. US President Donald Trump says the Iran ceasefire is on massive life support after Washington rejects the Tehran deal. UK leader Keir Starmer fights to stay in office as lawmakers urge him to resign. And the last group of passengers leave the hantavirus-hit cruise ship as 3 more cases test positive. The fragile ceasefire between Washington and Tehran is on life support, US President Donald Trump told reporters in the Oval Office. He flatly rejected the latest peace proposal from the Islamic Republic as the US ramps up economic pressure on the country.
A new diplomatic crisis is unfolding between the United States and Iran after President Donald Trump warned that efforts to secure a ceasefire are now hanging by a thread. From the Oval Office, Trump delivered some of his strongest remarks yet against Tehran, describing Iran's latest response to Washington's peace proposal as garbage and signaling a return to a maximum pressure campaign.
It's unbelievably weak, I would say. I would call it the weakest right now. After reading a piece of garbage they sent us, I didn't even finish reading it. They said, I'm not going to waste my time reading it. I would say it's one of the weakest right now. It's on life support. They understand these are all medical people. Dr. Oz, life support is not a good thing. Do you agree?
Bad prognostic.
I would say the ceasefire is on massive life support, where the doctor walks in and says, sir, your loved one has approximately a 1% chance of living.
Central to the deadlock remains Washington's demand for the total dismantling of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, a point the president insists is non-negotiable for global security.
Very simple. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. They can't have it. And if they did have it, the Middle East would be gone, Israel would be gone, and then hit Europe probably next. We're doing a service to the world.
In Tehran, the rhetoric is equally uncompromising. The Iranian Foreign Ministry maintains that its proposals are the only viable path to regional stability, accusing the US of being captive to Israeli interests.
Regrettably, the United States still insists on one-sided views and unreasonable demands, which are largely based on mindsets influenced by Israel.
As diplomacy falters, the US Treasury has announced fresh sanctions against 12 individuals and entities spanning Hong Kong, the UAE, and Oman. The move targets the IRGC's shadow fleet used to ship oil to China. Adding fuel to the fire, new reports suggest the conflict has already expanded. Investigative reports claim the UAE secretly struck an Iranian refinery on Lavan Island in April, leading to massive Iranian retaliatory strikes on Emirati infrastructure. With tensions affecting maritime routes and US naval forces on alert, attention now turns to President Trump's upcoming meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping, where Washington is expected to press Beijing on energy ties with Tehran.
US President Donald Trump is reportedly frustrated that talks with Iran over its nuclear program have stalled. US officials say military and maritime options are being considered if diplomacy fails. Here's Ubay Shabanda with more.
President Trump is frustrated at what he views to be Iran's refusal to respond appropriately to his proposal to resume negotiations. He met with his national security team on Monday to discuss options if the talks ultimately fail. The resumption of military operations against Iran has increased in probability as the talks between Tehran and Washington reached a deadlock on Sunday, according to US officials. Trump has publicly threatened several times in recent days to bomb Iranian infrastructure if diplomacy fails. The US waited 10 days for Iran's response to a draft proposal for ending the war. But Trump rejected Iran's response on Sunday, calling it inappropriate. President Trump recently said that he believes that the ceasefire with Iran is, quote, on massive life support. And Trump said that Iran had agreed previously to relinquish a stockpile of highly enriched uranium, but he said the Iranians have apparently reversed course because their response on Sunday omitted any mention of that critical issue. Trump said that Iranian leadership is, in his view, divided between, quote, moderates and lunatics. One option President Trump is considering is resuming Project Freedom, the U.S. operation to guide and escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz, which was suspended last week. Another option, according to reports, is the resumption of the bombing campaign in order for the U.S. and Israeli military to strike the remaining sets of targets that the U.S. did not hit in the previous military campaign. And according to fresh reports, the Israeli government reportedly wants President Trump to order a special forces operation to secure Iran's enriched uranium stockpile that remains buried following last year's strikes on Iran's underground and nuclear weapons program. But some officials have said that Trump is reportedly hesitant to order such an operation because it is highly risky. I'm Ube Shabander, A News, Washington.
Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian has supported the diplomatic track as a rational choice to secure the country's national interests, saying diplomacy can serve as a complement to the victory gained by the armed forces in the war with Israel and the United States. Our correspondent brings more from Tehran.
The Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has lent his support behind diplomacy, saying it is a rational choice to secure the country's national interests and complete the military achievements in the Israeli-US imposed war on Iran. According to President's office, he made this statement in a meeting with police commanders on Monday, stating that Iran faces three options of entering negotiations with dignity, remaining in a state of no war, no peace, or continuing confrontation. Amid the stalled talks with the US, Pezeshkian backed the track of diplomacy together with maintaining mistrust toward the US and remaining committed to national interests. Meantime, the spokesman of the Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, Ebrahim Rezai, quoted the head of Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, Mohammad Eslami, as saying that enrichment is not negotiable and nuclear assets are protected. Speaking to reporters following a meeting with Eslami, the MP said the issue of nuclear technology is not on the agenda of negotiations. The nuclear industry will continue powerfully and we will protect its achievements. While Iran and US seem moving away from an interim deal to end the war, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan held a phone call on Monday for the second time in 24 hours. According to a Foreign Ministry statement, the two ministers consulted on the latest developments related to the ongoing diplomatic process between Iran and the United States, mediated by Pakistan. And Deputy Foreign Minister for Legal Affairs, Kazem Garibabadi, in a post on X, condemned the U.S. draft UN Security Council resolution on the Strait of Hormuz as a bid to change the problem and doomed to failure. He said the joint draft resolution was tabled to turn the backlashes of a military aggression and illegal blockade into a case against the country that has been the target of threats, pressure, and attacks. Turash Shiralilu from Tehran for A News.
At least 6 people have been killed and 7 others wounded after an Israeli airstrike hit a residential building in southern Lebanon overnight. Lebanon State News Agency said the strike targeted a house in the town of Kfar Danun, while those injured were taken to hospitals in the coastal city of Tire. Israeli artillery shelling also struck areas near the towns of Mansouri and Majdal Zon at dawn on Tuesday. The attack comes despite a ceasefire that was announced on the 17th of April. And Lebanese officials say the conflict has so far killed thousands and displaced more than 1 million people. Fighting has continued between Russia and Ukraine despite a US-mediated 3-day ceasefire, which came into effect on the 9th of May, with both sides accusing each other of violating the temporary pause in combat.
Russia and Ukraine have both reported continued fighting along the front line, despite a 3-day ceasefire brokered by the United States. The temporary truce, which began on Friday and runs until May 11th, was part of a wider push by US President Donald Trump to revive peace efforts after more than 4 years of war. But the ceasefire is already showing signs of strain. Ukraine says Russian forces continued assaults along parts of the front line, while Moscow accused Kyiv of thousands of violations since the truce came into effect. President Volodymyr Zelensky said there had been no silence along the front line, despite the ceasefire announcement.
There was no silence on the front line today. There were hostilities. We have documented all of this. We can also see that Russia has no intention of ending this war, and we are preparing for new attacks, unfortunately. But there must be peace. That is precisely what we are working towards. The defense of Ukraine, Ukraine's independence, and the safety of our people. These are the most important things.
Russia's defense ministry, meanwhile, said its forces were responding to Ukrainian artillery and drone attacks. Ukraine's military reported around 180 clashes along the front line over the past 24 hours, with Russian forces continuing drone and artillery strikes in several regions. Regional officials in Ukraine say at least 3 people were killed in attacks in the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. The renewed fighting comes despite recent comments by Russian President Vladimir Putin suggesting the war may be entering its final phase. However, Kremlin officials have also cautioned that any future peace agreement would be a lengthy and complex process.
The United Kingdom and France are leading a major diplomatic push to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. On Tuesday, defence ministers from over 40 countries will meet to finalise plans for a new multinational escort mission. The talks will focus on mine clearing and air patrols to protect commercial vessels in what French President Emmanuel Macron calls a neutral effort to restore trade. It marks the first high-level summit for the operation as Europe seeks its own path to secure global shipping. The last remaining passengers have disembarked from the MV Hondias in Spain as health authorities continue a multinational operation to contain a deadly hantavirus outbreak linked to the luxury cruise ship.
The final passengers and crew members have disembarked from the MV Hondias in Tenerife, marking the latest stage in a major international health operation following a deadly hantavirus outbreak on board. Spanish authorities say more than 90 passengers and crew have now been evacuated and repatriated after weeks at sea, while the vessel has departed for the Netherlands for full disinfection. The World Health Organization says 7 confirmed cases of the Andes strain of hantavirus have now been identified, alongside 2 additional suspected infections. The Andes strain is considered particularly concerning because, unlike most hantaviruses, it can spread between humans in limited circumstances. US health officials say 18 passengers from the ship have now been flown to the United States and placed under medical monitoring and quarantine. Most are being treated at specialized facilities in Nebraska, where 1 confirmed patient is being held in a biocontainment unit. Officials say the risk to the wider public remains low, noting that the virus does not spread easily and usually requires prolonged close contact. Health officials say the evacuation operation aimed to balance public safety with the well-being of passengers, many of whom had spent weeks isolated on board.
As you can imagine, there was even mental breakdown for some of the passengers. It's very difficult to stay for weeks in a small container. You can imagine how it affects mentally. And many of them are also senior citizens and they have many chronic illnesses. And imagine carrying that for several weeks.
Authorities in several countries continue monitoring passengers under quarantine, including a Greek traveller transferred to a specialised isolation unit in Athens as a precaution. The World Health Organization says the overall public risk remains low, while investigations and contact tracing continue.
Great Britain's political scene is under strain as Prime Minister Keir Starmer faces mounting pressure within his own Labour Party. The unrest comes as senior figures raise concerns over his leadership following a series of recent political setbacks. Here's more.
British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is facing growing pressure from within the Labour Party, Britain's governing centre-left party, after around 70 Labour members of Parliament called for him to resign or urged him to announce when he plans to step down. Reports suggest splits are emerging inside Keir Starmer's cabinet, with some senior ministers privately supporting calls for a timetable for his departure, including Britain's Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood, who privately urged Keir Starmer to consider setting a clear timetable for his departure from office. The backlash follows disappointing election results across several parts of the UK. In Wales, one of the four nations that make up the United Kingdom, Labour lost control of the Welsh Parliament in Wales, while in Scotland, the Scottish National Party secured a fifth consecutive term in power. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage and his Reform UK party have made significant gains in local elections, winning more than 1,400 council seats in England and increasing pressure on Labour's leadership direction. Starmer has not directly responded to resignation calls, but has acknowledged government mistakes while defending his long-term strategy. In an attempt to shift momentum, he announced plans to nationalise British steel after a failed private sale and signalled closer ties with the European Union following Brexit. The coming weeks will be decisive for Starmer as he tries to restore confidence in his leadership or faces growing calls from within Labour to step down.
European Union defence ministers gathered in Brussels today for the Foreign Affairs Council defence meeting. The talks are chaired by the bloc's foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas and will focus on strengthening Europe's security. EU ministers are discussing continued support for Ukraine as Brussels considers how to use a proposed €90 billion loan package to meet Kyiv's urgent military needs. The Middle East is also high on the meeting's agenda, particularly the situation in Lebanon, where European officials are exploring the possibility of a new mission to support the Lebanese armed forces. European governments are also pushing manufacturers to increase arms production in timely manners.
We have the Defense Minister of Ukraine joining us, and of course there also the question how we can use the 90 billion loan and how does that all proceed so that it would answer to the urgent needs of Ukraine. And then we have a discussion of the defense industry and also together with the industry actually, because we see the problem that the defense ministers are pushing. The countries have a lot of funding on the table, but the defense industry is not ramping up their production. We discuss also Middle East, and Middle East specifically with the defense ministers, two topics. One is Lebanon. As we know, UNIFIL is ending by this year, and there is a willingness of the Europeans to put together another mission to actually help the Lebanese armed forces. And of course, we are already helping them.
The European Union foreign ministers have approved a new sanctions package targeting both violent Israeli settlers in the West Bank and senior Palestinian Hamas leaders. The move, previously stalled for months, focuses on 3 individuals and 4 organizations following a surge in violence in the occupied territories. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has already slammed the decision, calling it an act of moral bankruptcy, while Hamas has so far issued no response. Announcing the adopted measures in Brussels, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas emphasised that extremism will now face direct consequences.
But we have also seen the surge of settler violence in West Bank. Today, we reached a political agreement to sanction Israeli extremist settlers and entities. This goes together with new sanctions on leading Hamas figures. This means that we move from the political deadlock that was there for a long time. Violence and extremism carry consequences.
We'll take a short break now. When we return, we'll discuss the EU Defence Ministers meeting in Brussels with our guest, a specialist in European politics. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching A News. European Union defence ministers are meeting in Brussels for high-level discussions focused on the war in Ukraine, growing instability in the Middle East, and Europe's broader defence readiness. The talks come at a time of mounting geopolitical uncertainty, with European governments under increasing pressure to strengthen military coordination, boost defence capabilities and respond to a rapidly shifting global security environment. The meeting also reflects wider questions about Europe's strategic autonomy, particularly as conflicts on multiple fronts continue to test the continent's political and military preparedness. Let's bring in our guest now. Alexander Seal joins us, is a UK correspondent specialising in European politics, joining us from London, UK. Alexander, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So EU defence ministers are meeting at a time of simultaneous crises involving Ukraine and the Middle East. How challenging is this moment strategically for Europe?
Yes, so the meeting today is arguably the most significant in months because it shifts from donating to integrating. Ministers are finalizing EU support loans for 2026. But the strategic pivot is the focus on defense industry cooperation. The EU is trying to bring Ukraine directly into its industrial base. We are looking at a roadmap where by 2027, 40% of procurement is done jointly. So for Ukraine, this means moving from being an aid recipient to becoming a core partner in European arms production, specifically in high-tech areas like drones, where the European Drone Defense Initiative is drawing directly from Ukrainian combat data to protecting European borders.
And the meeting is also focused on defence preparedness, Alexander. Is Europe moving from reactive crisis management toward longer-term military planning?
Yes, and also there is also a focus in the situation in the Middle East because it connects directly through the Strait of Hormuz blockade. As you remember, a few weeks ago, there was a meeting in Paris when the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer met with Emmanuel Macron and 40 other leaders to discuss the situation. This is a central topic for ministers today. This isn't just a regional issue, it's a direct threat to the global economy and European energy stability. While the EU meets in Brussels, there is a fascinating split. The UK and France are co-chairing a 40-nation summit today specifically to restore trade flows. We have the French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle and the British destroyer HMS Dragon already pre-positioned in the region. This is defense readiness in action, as you said, moving from policy papers in Brussels to naval presence in the Middle East.
And so, as you said, as part of the meeting, talks will also include finalising plans for a new multinational escort mission. Again, surrounding to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. What does that entail? How much do we know about that?
Well, it's really a trap question often asked in London and Paris. The answer also from today's meeting in Brussels, stressed by Sweden's Defense Minister Pal Johnson, is that all this must complement NATO, not compete with it. And readiness isn't just about a single army, it's about a defense single market. It's about ensuring that if a crisis hits Europe, Europe has the industrial capacity to produce ammunition without relying solely on the US. It's a whole of society model where public-private cooperation ensures that critical infrastructure and supply chains can function under the pressure of high-intensity warfare.
Mm-hmm. And support for Ukraine remains central to EU security policy. Is there concern in Brussels about sustaining political unity and military support over time?
Yes, yes, there is. And one has to also mention Kaja Kallas. She's one of the clearest voices pushing Europe towards a much stronger security posture. And coming from Estonia, she represents a broader Eastern European view that Europe underestimated the Russian threat for too long. Her position is that Europe needs faster military readiness, stronger defense coordination, and greater long-term support for Ukraine. She is also pushing the idea that Europe cannot continue relying excessively on American military protection and must develop stronger capabilities itself. So she symbolizes the growing influence of Eastern Europe inside a European defense policy.
Okay, and at the same time, instability in the Middle East continues to hold a critical space. Is affecting energy, it's also affecting energy markets, migration concerns, regional security. How much is that reshaping European priorities?
Yes, it's really a huge priority. And also, there is also the Syrian angle that's really interesting because just yesterday, the EU made a historic policy shift by lifting sanctions on Syria's interior and defense ministers. This is part of a broader reset to support political transition after years of suspension. High representatives even held the first high-level political dialogue with Syrian authorities in Brussels. This logic is simple. The EU has realized that you cannot have defense readiness on regional stability while ignoring the Syrian nexus. They are front-loading cooperation now to prevent a further spillover from Iran and ensure that the fragile Middle East ceasefire holds.
And discussions around strategic autonomy have intensified in recent years. Is the EU genuinely becoming more independent in terms of in defence terms, or does it still rely fundamentally on NATO and the United States?
Well, as you know, the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has always been an ally to the US, but he's now trying to shift towards Europe. So really, politically, there is a clear momentum towards greater defense spending and military readiness. But Europe still faces structural challenges, fragmented procurement systems, industrial bottlenecks, and different national priorities. So the political ambition is very strong, but transforming that ambition into actual military capability will take time. What today's Brussels meeting really shows is that Europe increasingly believes the era of guaranteed stability is over, and European leaders are now trying to determine whether Europe is actually prepared for that new reality.
Okay, and one final question, Alexander. Do all EU member states view the current security environment in the same way, or are there growing internal differences over priorities and responses?
What we're seeing is a major strategic reassessment. European governments increasingly believe that many of the assumptions underpinning post-Cold War stability no longer apply. The debate now is about how quickly Europe can adapt to a more unstable geopolitical environment with the war in Iran and also the war in Ukraine and Trump's instabilities at the moment.
Okay. Alexander, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you so much for joining us and your analysis.
Thank you.
After the break, we'll take a look at the key stories shaping the region. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News, and now we turn to our regional stories. A tanker carrying 45,000 kilolitres of Azerbaijani crude oil has arrived in Japan, marking a historic first for the two nations as the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz continues. The shipment, totalling over 280,000 barrels, is part of Tokyo's urgent strategy to diversify energy sources away from the volatile Middle East. This delivery represents a strategic milestone for Japan, establishing a new energy corridor from Central Asia that bypasses regional choke points. The shipped oil is now headed to Enyo's Negishi refinery to bolster fuel supplies for the greater Tokyo area. Azerbaijan strengthens its role in regional transit and logistics as the first dry cargo vessel, Gadamli, built in Turkmenistan, arrives at the Baku International Sea Trade Port. The new vessel is expected to boost cargo transportation between Baku and Turkmenbashi and support the growing development of the middle corridor connecting Asia and Europe. Our correspondent Gulcin Kojalieva has more.
Hello from Port of Baku, where behind me stands the newly arrived dry cargo vessel Gadamli, officially welcomed during a ceremonial reception at the Baku International Sea Trade Port. Built in Turkmenistan, the vessel has completed its maiden voyage across the Caspian Sea and is expected to strengthen cargo transportation links between the ports of Baku and Turkmenbashi. Officials say the vessel will operate regular container transportation services between Baku and Turkmenbashi, supporting the development of the middle corridor and wider Eurasian trade routes. The Gadamli has a carrying capacity of 6,100 tons and can transport up to 240 standard shipping containers. Port authorities say the vessel is expected to contribute to increasing cargo turnover at the port of Baku as regional transit volumes continue to grow. The welcoming ceremony brought together railway, maritime and port officials, underlying the strategic importance of cooperation between Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan in expanding transport connectivity across the Caspian Sea. This is Gulcin Kojalieva with Zohrab Shirinov for A News.
China is continuing to strengthen its influence in Central Asia, with Tajikistan emerging as one of Beijing's closest regional partners. During a state visit to China, President Emomali Rahmon signed a multi-billion-dollar package of agreements aimed at expanding cooperation across key sectors of the economy. Our correspondent reports from the region.
Tajikistan and China are deepening their strategic partnership. During President Emomali Rahmon's state visit to Beijing, the two sides signed more than 50 agreements valued at over $8 billion. The new deals focus on energy, mining, agriculture, logistics, digitalization, artificial intelligence and green development. The visit comes as China continues to expand its economic footprint in Tajikistan. According to official figures, Chinese investment in the country has now reached nearly $6 billion, including around $3.5 billion in direct investment. Speaking to Chinese business leaders in Beijing, Rahmon described Tajikistan as a reliable investment partner and a key link in future transport and energy corridors connecting China with South Asia and the Middle East. Today, more than 300 state investment projects totaling roughly $13 billion are being implemented across Tajikistan, many involving Chinese companies. And more than 700 firms with Chinese capital are already operating in the country. Analysts say Tajikistan now has some of the closest ties with Beijing in Central Asia, not only in trade and infrastructure, but also in security and long-term political cooperation. President Rahmon's visit is expected to continue through May 14th, with talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping scheduled in the coming days. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
In Vienna, an Azerbaijani cultural event is bringing together music and tradition ahead of the Eurovision Song Contest semi-final. Our presenter Katie Wilson has more.
This might look like Baku right behind me now, but actually we're still in Vienna. We're here at the Azerbaijani Cultural Center for a night of Azerbaijani music and celebrating Azerbaijani culture. Of course, it's all ahead of Eurovision, which is hosted here in the Austrian capital. So tonight is about celebrating Azerbaijani music with a touch of Mozart. Right here at the piano, we heard a piece called Mozart in Baku, a nice little mix of both cultures there. And that's what this evening is about, celebrating not only Azerbaijani culture, but Azerbaijani diaspora in Austria. Of course, this is all ahead of Jiva's semi-final at Eurovision, which will take place on Thursday. And we've been speaking to her ahead of her performance and about what she thinks of not only this evening, but her chances in Vienna.
I'm so proud that I'm here. So for me, I want to do a good performance, a best performance, and to be in touch everybody's heart, and do my beautiful music. And I'm not thinking about qualified or not qualified.
It's about the music.
Yes, it's about music and performance at this big stage, and this is my time.
Well, for every Azerbaijani, Eurovision Song Contest is something that is very close to our hearts, because we also host the Eurovision Song Contest in Baku before, and it was one of the most successful Eurovision events, concerts, I would say. I was there, I was just 12 years old, but the emotion stays all the way. And this is something unforgettable, and we wanted to be part of this unforgettable event, unforgettable song contest, and to invite our delegation, to invite other delegations here, and to welcome everyone here, as this is part of Azerbaijan, we believe, and we try to show the beauty, the cultural feeling of Azerbaijan.
Participation of Azerbaijan was such a renowned singer, such a beautiful song, is actually a reflection of what Azerbaijan is today. Nation which is proud of its past and looking into a future. And what you, the glimpse of what you have seen today, the performance, is actually representing the best of Azerbaijan's talent, and of course we already can be proud of participation of our singer at the Eurovision Song Contest.
We'll take a short break now. When we return, we'll discuss the transport of Azerbaijani crude oil to Japan, marking a historic first for the two nations as the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz continues. We'll see you shortly. Welcome back to A News. We now shift our focus to a regional story for discussion. Japan has received Azerbaijani oil for the first time since the start of the Middle East crisis, and for the first time ever, highlighting shifting global energy dynamics and the growing strategic importance of alternative supply routes. The development comes as Tokyo continues adjusting to sanctions-related constraints involving Russia, while also seeking to reduce vulnerability to instability affecting traditional Middle Eastern energy corridors. The move is also drawing attention to Azerbaijan's expanding role within the emerging Middle Corridor and what some analysts describe as a new energy and connectivity nexus linking Europe, Central Asia and East Asia. Let's bring in our guest now. Professor Seijiro Takeshita at the University of Shizuoka in Shizuoka City, Japan, joins us. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Japan's received Azerbaijani oil for the first time since the Middle East crisis began. How important is this development strategically?
Very important, in the sense that we basically rely 99.6% of oil from external sources, and 93% of that comes from Middle East, which means that there's an excessive reliance there. And for that reason, what we needed to do was basically diversify our distribution base. And we've been saying this since 1990s. But unfortunately, after the East Japan earthquake back in 2011, our reliance ratio on oil has increased even more, also to the Middle East. We used to have like 30% of electricity generated by nuclear, but that's dropped to zero. And then now it's come back, clawed itself back to about 8%, but that's not enough. So what we really need to do is increase the capability and the distribution base, which also, from a security point of view, very, very important, as you reported earlier, because we need to diversify our supply chain away from unitarian states like that of China.
Okay, so 93% of supply there is actually a very heavy amount. To what extent is the ongoing instability in the Middle East forcing countries like Japan to rethink long-standing energy supply expectations?
Basically, to revamp and increase and diversify their supply chain. It's not only oil, but for example, Japan has also opened up its door to Central Asian nations as far as rare metal is concerned. And I think many had been starting to consider this after the COVID-19, when we realized that our global supply chain is excessively dominated by unitarian states like that of China. So therefore, we needed to diversify. So this news or this target strategy isn't anything new. But for Japan, unfortunately, because of the great earthquake that we saw, and also the fact that Japanese industry like semiconductor, precision machinery needs stable energy, we cannot resort to alternative energies like windmills or wind powers or solar powers. That could be used for individual housing, but for industrial use, we need to rely on something much more reliable, which is either nuclear or oil.
Mm-hmm. And Japan's participation in sanctions involving Russia has also complicated energy calculations. How much is that accelerating Tokyo's search for alternative suppliers?
Very much. Good question. I mean, we do have 239 days of reserve, but that said, as you just reported, we are extremely vulnerable, probably one of the most vulnerable countries in the world as far as troubles to be seen in the Middle East. And for that reason, I think, diversification of supply chain is something that, is of utmost importance in the list. The problem here is that these things are quite delicate in this movement because we can't cut off ties, instantly with many of the nations we already have a relationship with, and particularly, as you reported, especially the likes of Transactional 25, who basically wants to benefit from both the unitarian state and the free world, would have to be very careful, in taking steps on the next milestone in regards to this matter.
Now, Azerbaijan is increasingly positioning itself as a reliable energy and transit partner. How important is that role becoming in the current geopolitical environment?
Very much. I mean, as you reported earlier, middle corridor is something that, countries like Japan is yearning for, because obviously from security point of view, we're definitely under the umbrella of the United States and free allied nations. So obviously, we have to divert away from pressure of unitarian states like that of Russia and China. And also all the trouble that we're seeing in the Middle East. Then, the only resolution to come from these two incidents or two phenomena is to find a new distribution pathways. And for that reason, creating a middle corridor will be something that's a little bit too late, but, never better late than never. And definitely this is some of the things that, Japanese government is really pedaling fast to create a better, I would say, standings.
Now, the middle corridor is often discussed in trade and connectivity terms. Are we now also seeing it evolve into an energy security corridor?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Again, it's not only energy, but it's also to do with various issues like rare metals, for example. So from that point of view, it directly connects to security of the region. Now, if you're in, eastern part of Asia, southeastern part of Asia, you would constantly feel the threat from the likes of China, the Philippines, the Japanese, the Taiwanese, the Vietnamese, you name it. And, violation of airspace, sea space is happening every day. And for that reason, security issue is another very, very important issue that is on agenda. In fact, in one of the top agendas in these countries. So obviously, to create a new distribution methodology in its supply chain is probably one of the most important factors to be considered as far as security issues are concerned.
And Professor, some analysts are now speaking about an emerging Eurasian energy nexus linking the Caspian region, Central Asia and East Asia. How realistic is that concept in your view?
I think it's becoming more and more realistic. The more we see these trouble in Middle East and the more the division of hegemony between the United States and unitarian states like that of China and Russia, if all these things start to basically emerge even more, then I think there will be a lot of, I would say, medium-sized countries, in other words, not the superpowers, making coalition with each other and to basically ward off these threats. And we're seeing that happening in Japan versus Europe, and as we speak, seeing it with Azerbaijan and a lot of Central Asian nations. So I think this trend will accelerate from here onwards.
And my final question, Professor, could this development lead to broader strategic cooperation between Azerbaijan and Japan beyond energy?
Certainly hope so. I mean, we've always had very good relationships. Japan was one of the first countries to basically congratulate, Azerbaijan, and I think Azerbaijan doesn't take any fees in visa. Am I correct for the Japanese? Well, jokes aside, seriously, it's a lot of give and take that could derive from both countries, and I think Azerbaijan would benefit a lot from our technology, and you can walk away from the old infrastructural ties with one of these unitarian states, whereas Japan could sustain a lot better and also diversified chain of goods. So from that point of view, I would say that there should have been more, and there will be more of a corporations coming through, particularly through companies like INPEX in Japan on oil, gas development, what have you.
Professor Sejura, it's always a pleasure having you on A News. Thank you for your analysis today.
Thank you.
And that's the news for this hour. Stay tuned to A News for all the latest updates.